Hello, class. Welcome to this lecture, Introduction to Orpheus and Orphism. Here we can start with the testimony of the 1st century BCE author Diodorus Siculus, who informs us that Orpheus was the son of Eurydice, a Thracian by race. In culture, music, and poetry, he was easily the first of those whose memory has been preserved. He composed poetry of a merit which astonishes and distinguishes by its exceptionally melodious quality. His reputation grew so great that he was believed to move both the beasts and the trees by his song. When he had spent much time in study and found out the myths which are concerned with theology, he went to live in Egypt, where he added greatly to his knowledge and became the foremost of the Greeks in theology, cult ceremonies, poetry, and music. He was a member of the expedition of the Argonauts, and out of love for his wife was led to perform the incredible feat of descending into Hades, where he charmed Persephone with his music and prevailed on her to further his desires and allow him to bring up his dead wife by Hades like another Dionysus. This single paragraph in Diodorus actually tells us quite a lot. Hailing from Thrace and an important member of the Argonautica expedition, it also gives us the most remembered myth of Orpheus, the descent to fetch his wife, Eurydice, here unnamed, from Hades. Interestingly, Diodorus adds that this makes Orpheus like another Dionysus, since Dionysus as well is a god who has the power to bring back from the dead and even to immortalize. Orpheus takes his place alongside the poet-musician founders of Greek religion, myth, and culture, Homer and Hesiod, very often among the Greeks as the first in their rank, and often as the earliest, and at the same time, he's a mythical hero at the level of fame and importance as the man become god, Heracles. So in beginning to pursue this question, who was Orpheus, let's review for a bit what we've already encountered in the course. Indeed, the Orphic branches of Greek mythology and religion have come up an innumerable number of times in our course. Here we'll be looking more strictly and precisely at the arguably historical and/or merely mythological poet-founder Orpheus, at what scholars sometimes call, not without a lot of contestation, the Orphic religion, as well as some recent developments in the now enormous area of study known as Orphic studies. Our textbook concurs in the very controversial, as we'll see, claim that Orpheus's original home was Thrace. Diodorus informs us that Eurydice was a king, although he's sometimes also said to be a river god. Rivers often being important places of Orphic initiation and the Orphic song. Often his father is neither a river or a king, but the god Apollo himself, to whom Orpheus was thought to have been particularly devoted. He also has strong Dionysian associations, and the mythology of Orpheus's life certainly had a long history. In this course so far, we've encountered Orpheus in the Orphic poems or hymns many times. First, in the lecture on Hesiod, we looked into the comic poet Aristophanes and his parody of Orphic cosmogony and the Orphic version of the god Eros, sometimes thought to be a joke cosmogony. Elsewhere, Diodorus Siculus tells us that the Thracian Orpheus was indeed the founder of the Samothracian mysteries on the island of Samos, and even that Orpheus traveled to Crete, where his mysteries were practiced openly from an early date. We've also seen in the Demeter and Persephone lecture extensive testimony regarding his role as a founder of the Eleusinian mysteries. And we've also covered Orphic myths in connection with Zagreus, Dionysus, Demeter, Persephone, Athena, Zeus, Selene, the Curetes or Corybantes, and in the Hades lecture we explored recent evidence regarding Orphic mysteries and the afterworld journey. In the mind of the average Greek, from the Archaic through the Classical periods and beyond, Orpheus is one of the three major poet founders of Greek mythology and religion, alongside Homer and Hesiod, and sometimes even earlier than them as their progenitor. He is credited with Theogonies, the Theologos as he's most often called, but also, unlike Hesiod, he's a founder of cultic religious practices. His most traditional dates range from shortly before Homer and Hesiod to slightly after, or sometimes much before. On some datings as far back as the Bronze Age and Mycenaean times, Orpheus is distinctive in having a protean and highly individualized character, as well as having more conflicting myths than any other major poet founder or mythic hero. Did Orpheus really exist, perhaps as early as the heroic age, the age of the Argonautic voyage, a generation or two before the Trojan War? Most Greeks believed he did, although Aristotle famously in classical times says there was no poet Orpheus and attributed the Orphic poems to Onomatokritos. Debates about the authenticity of so-called Orphic books were already very common in antiquity. It is only from the late Archaic Age and onwards that we have evidence for the existence of poems attributed to Orpheus and Orphic cult and ritual. Whether or not there was a founder Orpheus will likely never be resolved, but indisputably Greek religion is indelibly marked and transformed by the many traditions that bear Orpheus's name. Already in the 5th century BCE, the historian Herodotus wonders whether certain practices which have been called Orphic or Bacchic, such as the prohibition of burying people in wool garments, are really in their origins Egyptian and Pythagorean. And while we don't hear about the historical Orpheus in Herodotus, we do there find the first mention of the version of Dionysus particularly associated with Orpheus and Orphic cult, Dionysus Zagreus. Much of the scanty evidence for and against a historical Orpheus comes from late antiquity, especially Siculus, Strabo, and Pausanias. And alas, it mounts to very little and nothing at all fully reliable. Classical and archaic authors frequently cite the so-called Orphic poems and take the historical existence of Orpheus as a founder more or less for granted, usually considering him a demigod-type figure on a par with Hercules. Very different than other Greek heroes, Orpheus is a gentle poet-musician and a religious reformer, a bringer of peace and of initiatory joy. He is usually depicted as master above all of the telestic hymn, i.e. the ritual song that renews the relatedness of gods and mortals, that appeases divine wrath, that heals humanity, and brings benefits and boons to mortals. The power of his magic song earned him an important role in the voyage of the Argonautica as the Calustes, that is the one who sings the rower's time, charms the stormy seas and clashing rocks, and calls sleep on the dragon who guards the golden fleece. And again, his most famous myth concerns his catabasis to Hades and his death. Although we can't say if Orpheus himself really existed, certainly Orphic literature and religion did. Although, like with much of Greek mythology and philosophy, what has come down to us is only fragments. Pindar, the pre-Socratic philosophers, Plato, the Greek dramatists are all important sources for what we might piece together as Orphism. And they are all sources much earlier. The only more or less complete volume of Orphic songs that we have, written in the 2nd century CE, the Orphic hymns. Again, in the mind of the average Greek, Orphic inspiration was most frequently associated with mystery cult and with initiation. And most ancient authors associate Orpheus with the founding or the reform of cult sanctuaries such as those at Eleusis and Samothrace. On the one hand, Orpheus is the revered founder of mysteries and of telestic initiations, i.e. of a religion, and on the other, he's frequently associated with a magical literary tradition, or what Plato calls a hubbub of books. How do we recognize the so-called Orphic religion? We can begin to do so by briefly summarizing some tenets of Orphic belief, generally agreed upon by most scholars: the purity of soul, the corruption of the body, original sin, transmigration of the soul, and apotheosis. First, the Orphics believed in the purification of the soul through katharmoi and initiation, telete, or bakuine. Cleansing and initiation can indeed bring about for the Orphic the cleansing and the liberation of the soul, of our divine nature. As well, the Orphics are thought to have taught the idea that the body is corrupt, or a tomb, soma sema, that we live in these bodies as in the underworld. Only through the Orphic way of life and Orphic initiation can we hope to attain a higher status or blessedness in the afterlife. Interestingly, and well before Augustine's Christianity, the Orphics seem to have taught a version of the doctrine of original sin. We inherit the corruption of the Titans who slew and ate Dionysus, and Zeus struck them with his thunderbolt, and human beings were formed from the ashes. Humans thus inherit the corruption of the Titans, and our bodies are mostly Titanic prisons, although we still have a spark of Dionysian soul. One of the prohibitions which flow from our Titanic nature in this bizarre version of original sin is that meat eating is criminal, as is animal sacrifice, and Orphism, like Pythagoreanism, is associated with vegetarianism. Although there is not much directly on transmigrating souls in what survives of Orphic writings, we can surmise from especially Pythagoras, Empedocles, and Plato that Orphism is particularly associated with the doctrine of transmigration. If the mortal state is a punishment, the soul must have committed its crimes as an immortal being, a fallen daimon theory. We also find the idea of metempsychosis or reincarnation in the Orphic Rhapsodies. Because of the perceivedly exotic and oriental flavor of many of these teachings in the context of Greek religion, scholars have routinely been prejudiced against Orphism, as Erwin Rhodes says when he calls it a drop of alien blood in the Greek soul. the influence in Orphism of Near Eastern and Egyptian ideas seems probable. Barton West concludes that the idea of metempsychosis, although it cannot be excluded from earlier lost Orphic writings, also cannot be proven. The most important tenet of Orphic belief for Orphic practice is apotheosis, the idea of a ritual theology which brings about a union with divine spirit, as well as a better destiny in the afterlife. Orphic poetic ritual brings about holistic enosis, that is, a ritualistic unifying of divinity and humanity through special rites. The image of the soul's return to primordial unity here appears as the pure enjoy perpetual feasting after death, while the rest lie buried in mud or carry water in a sieve. Just as the mythical figure Orpheus is highly individualized, so is the Orphic idea of the individual soul. Rather than dissolving into a general world soul after death, the true Orphic initiate retains their individual soul identity or experience, and perhaps exists in an astral body, like a star. The most highly debated and contested facet of Orphic mythical belief is the so-called Orphic Anthropogony, or myth of the creation of human beings. According to this myth, Zeus mated with Cora, or Persephone, and Dionysus Zagreus was born. The infant god was then dismembered and devoured by the monstrous Titans released from Tartarus, who were then struck down in punishment by the thunderbolt of Zeus. From the ashes of the Titans came mortals, and thus humans are partly evil and mortal, but also partly pure and divine, since the wicked Titans had consumed the god, although not completely. The heart of Dionysus is said to have been saved, sometimes by Pallas Athena, and the rebirth of Dionysus from his palpitating heart becomes the scene of his third birth, first being from his mother Semele and the second from Zeus's thigh. This myth is more contested than any others which we inherit from Orphic literatures, and is still a foundational myth in modern definitions of Orphism. We've covered it already in the Dionysus and Athena lecture, and according to Chrysanthou, it in fact dates from at least the early classical period. By classical times, if not earlier, Orphism was best known as a religion of the book, a hubbub of books according to Plato. The question is whether the general disrepute that itinerant Orphic practitioners were held in also extended to official Orphic mysteries and initiations. And here it seems that in fact, Orpheus and Orphic poetry and religion was revered. The Orphic poems in circulation were various. See M.L. West's The Orphic Poems, which we'll turn to in a minute. And we can note how the Rhapsodic Theogony is the only one that comes down to us in a truly significant number of fragments, and became the standard in Hellenistic antiquity. Alongside this, scholars have reconstructed what they call the Dreveni, or protagonists, the Hieronyman, the Eudemian, and Cyclic cosmogonies. More on these soon. There are many parallels and divergences in narrative between these various cosmogonies, but let's start with the most famous feature of Orphic Cosmotheogony. The arc gods are Chronos, time, and Andrasteia, Anarche or necessity, and this Chronos Andrasteia, a twofold being, is also imagined as fourfold, with four heads. Between them emerges a cosmic egg, and a serpent, probably Andrasteia, splits the egg. If you ever wanted decisive resolution of the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, you can look to Plutarch's witty quip on this, cited by West, when in the context of a jovial debate, we hear, "I will sing for those of understanding, that Orphic and sacred story, which not only makes the egg older than the bird, but attributes to it comprehensive seniority over everything." Some interpreters think that this points to the priority of matter or materialism in Orphic thought, and especially air, the idea of the wind egg. In any case, when the egg splits, ether is separated from Erebus, the upper world from the lower world, and the god Phanes emerged, who has many names, also Bromius, Erechpaios, and Eros. Phanes and then Night or Nyx are the first rulers. The rule of succession goes more standardly then to Gaia, to Uranos, to the Titans, to Chronos and Zeus. Zeus shores up his rule not by swallowing Metis and giving birth to Athena, among other deeds in Hesiod, but by swallowing the first god himself, Phanes, and along with him all creation. Thereby Zeus becomes the one, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And he also mates with Persephone to give birth to Dionysus, Dionysus Zagreus, and Persephone above all, becoming the savior and mediating gods for all Orphic initiates. We'll discuss the reconstruction of the Orphic cosmogonies and the Rhapsodies in particular in a minute, but before we do, it's worth underlining again that our only more or less complete source of Orphic hymns and poetry is the much later Orphic hymns, generally dated from the 1st to the 2nd century CE. Learn now Musaeus, mystical and most holy rites, a prayer which surely excels all others. Kind Zeus and earth, heavenly and pure flames of the sun, sacred light of the moon and of all the stars, I call upon these gentle gods, and I call upon Pronoia, and on the holy daimon. I also call the daimon baneful to mortals. Then I invoke divinities dwelling in the sky, in the air, in the water, on earth and under the earth, beginning and end too, which to all is most important, and I ask them to come in the spirit of joyous mercy, to this holy rite, to this reverend libation. According to West, there is no reason to think that the Orphic hymns are the same as an earlier collection of Orphic hymns cited in the Dionysian papyrus. They certainly cannot be identified with the 87 hymns that have come down to us in the company with the hymns of Homer, Callimachus, and Proclus. They form a single collection, bound together by homogeneity of style and technique, and probably composed by a single author. They were used by members of a private cult society who met at night in a house and prayed to all the gods they could think of, to the light of torches and the fragrances of 8 varieties of incense. Occasionally, their ceremonial activity went as far as libations of milk. Get a picture of cheerful and inexpensive dabbling in religion by a literary-minded burgher and his friends, perhaps in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. Dionysus is the most prominent deity in these hymns, being the recipient under different titles of 8 hymns. The fiction that Orpheus is the author is supported by a couple of allusions to Apollo and Calliope as his parents. Indeed, the Orphic hymns sing to many deities, both more commonly known and obscure. You can see a list of a few of them here. Other scholars disagree with West here that our dating of our extant copy of the Orphic hymns is a settled issue, for there are many reasons to believe they were compiled while also utilizing earlier sources. I, for one, consider the hymns exceedingly beautiful, and to have many passages which may indeed be of an archaic provenance. Alongside the Athanasicus translations assigned for this course, you can also pick up the dual language edition by Patrick Dunn, the Orphic Hymns, and also the earlier Thomas Taylor translations, the Hymns of Orpheus. Adding to our list of so-called Orphic literatures to consider, we have what's known as the Orphic Argonautica, probably penned in the 2nd to the 4th centuries CE, and to be distinguished from the earlier Argonautica of Apollonius Rhodes. Traditional dates of the Argonautica journey led by Jason for the Golden Fleece, in which Orpheus was a central member in the troupe of heroes, is 1300 to 1100 BCE. As West writes, something of the quantity and diversity of Orphic poetry in late antiquity can be gauged from a passage in the Orphic Argonautica. This poem of about 1400 lines occupies an exceptional place in Orphic literature, being an autobiographical narrative in which Orpheus, heavily influenced by the reading of Apollonius Rhodius, tells the story of his participation in Jason's expedition. He speaks of himself in general terms as a revealer of mysteries, and his opus list of Orphic poetry books gives pride of place to the Rhapsodies. We are not sure which other Orphic books the author read exactly, but at least the Rhapsodic Theogony seems certain. The opening invocation to Apollo, followed by the Theogony, and addressed to Musaeus, like the Orphic hymns, reads, "O powerful lord of Putho, far thrower, also a seer, whose place is high atop the Parnassus rock. Of your power I sing. In turn may your gift furnish me with glory and send your true voice into my mind, so that by the imposition of the Muses I may disperse a fine song to the numberless race of men with the help of my well-made Kithara. For now to you, O worker of the lyre, singer of pleasing songs, when driven by the goad of Bacchus and Lord Apollo, I describe their terrible shafts, and likewise disclose the cure for feeble mortal bodies, and the great rites to the initiates. Truly, above all, I disclose the stern inevitability of ancient chaos and time, who in his boundless coils produced ether, and the twofold beautiful and noble Eros, whom the younger men call Phanes, celebrated parent of eternal light, because he himself first manifested." And this constitutes our initial inventory of the so-called Orphic texts or Orphic literatures. First, we have the various fragments that have come down to us, readable in the Otto Kern edition, and mostly from the Orphic Rhapsodies and various other theogonies. Then the Dionysian papyrus, a more recent discovery, which is the oldest surviving papyrus manuscript in Europe and dates to the 5th to 4th centuries BCE. Then the Argonautica Orphica, from closer to the end of the Hellenistic world, as well as the Orphic gold tablets and the 87 Orphic hymns. Tony Chrysos, in a lecture on Orphic tradition from 2018, remarks that this is the Orphic corpus, and believe me, it is more than we need to understand the mysteries and theology of Orpheus. At least, that is how I feel. The dating of the Orphic hymns, Chrysos, who seems indebted to Guthrie, appears to sidestep West's insistence that the dating of the 87 Orphic hymns has been decisively settled. It lies in the 1st to 3rd century CE, so the story goes, in the Roman imperial period. But the question of the antiquity of contents and phrasing in the hymns continues to be debated, and many phrases in them lend crucial evidence in scholarly reconstructions of yet more ancient Orphism. For example, Chrysos quotes an untranslated PhD dissertation by a Greek archaeoastronomer, former head of the planetarium at Athens, who argues that some passages allow us to date phrases of great antiquity, such as the Orphic hymn to Apollo, the line giving them equal measure of summer and winter, which might be dated to the phenomena of equal summer and winter, which occurred throughout the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE. I am not an archaeoastronomer and have no idea how to evaluate this, but it is interesting. And here West points to the interesting evidence on the Parian marble about the dating of Orpheus and his hymn to Cora Demeter, which mythically founds the Eleusinian mysteries. West writes, on the Parian marble, which dates from 264 to 3 BC, there is mention of a poem on the rape of Cora and Demeter's search for her, the sacred story of Eleusis, supposedly published in the reign of Erechtheus, thought to be around 1398 BC. The poet's name is not preserved on the marble, but Orpheus is a probable restoration. Read in fragment 14 of the Parian marble from when Orpheus made known his own poetry. The rape of Cora and the search of Demeter and the city created by her, and the multitude of those receiving the poem, 1,135 years have passed since Erechtheus was king of Athens. This makes Orpheus, according to the chronology stated in marble, which is our earliest Greek chronology, over 3,500 years old. West comments, it is possible that the poem was none other than the Homeric hymn to Demeter, for in a papyrus of the 1st century BCE, the story is told in prose with verse quotations from Orpheus, and the verses, which are evidently quoted from memory, all occur in the Homeric hymn. Some students of Orphic religion take this evidence of the dating of Orpheus from the Parian marble seriously, and others are more doubtful, seeing it as yet another mythical chronology. Another important topic to mention at the outset is the connection of Orpheus and Orphic literatures to Bacchic mysteries. Orpheus's association with Dionysiac or Bacchic rites is present from the Archaic and Classical period, but is more extensively elaborated in Hellenistic and Roman antiquity. As West comments on this, from the 1st century BC, literary references to Orphic Dionysiac rites become too numerous to set out. It is sufficient to refer to Linforth's Convenience Survey, that is in his book The Arts of Orpheus. Alexander the Great is said to have been an enthusiastic participant in the Macedonian Bacchanalia, which Plutarch at any rate calls Orphic. More ancient evidence for Bacchic connections can be found in the gold leaves and bone fragments. Additionally, evidence for Bacchic connections to Orphism is found in the historian Herodotus, as we've read, as well as vase paintings and terracottas, which suggest a major role for Orpheus in Dionysiac mysteries. And as we've noted, Dionysus also has more hymns devoted to him, 8, than any other god in the Orphic hymns. We cannot conclude that all Bacchism is Orphic, but we can conclude that much of Orphic religion is distinctively Bacchic, often in a special sense peculiar to Orphism. On the ambiguity of Apollonian and Dionysian elements in the mythologies of Orpheus, our textbook points to the death of Orpheus, said to be a son of Apollo, but torn to pieces by women followers of Dionysus. There are many conflicting speculations about this, and a fundamental duality in Orphic religion is evident. He is linked in one way or another to both Dionysus and Apollo. Orpheus is torn to pieces like Dionysus himself, at the hands of the Titans, or like Pentheus, who also opposed the god and met destruction at the hands of the Maenads. In his earlier study, Orpheus and Orphic Religion, Guthrie wonders if there was a real Orpheus, should we understand him as a missionary in Thrace, who met his death violently because he championed Apollo against Dionysus, or Dionysus against Apollo? Did Orpheus compromise and adapt the religion of the Near Eastern Dionysus to that of Hellenic Apollo, drawing from both deities and preaching a message of synthesis that was somehow new and convincing? You can note in approaching this topic that the name Orpheus itself may derive from the Greek word orphe, darkness, which might make Orpheus, etymologically at least, a singer from darkness, a bringer of light out of the dark, and even a vertical integration of the Chthonic and the Uranian aspects of Greek religion, i.e. a poet-founder who preached a fusion of Dionysian and Apollonian religion. Guthrie helps us to more deeply grapple with this question, for the music, magic, and prophecy indeed suggest the god Apollo, as does his championing of civilization, but Orpheus's sermon of gentleness and peace has none of the violence of the archer god. Orpheus's music can also be understood as the antithesis of the clashing din of Bacchus, and the tales of his misogyny could imply a religion that at some point was confined to men, in contrast to the worship of Dionysus, which often appealed to women. At the same time, however, Orphic initiation and mysteries are, by their very nature and in most of our surviving evidence, Dionysiac. Whether or not the actual historical Orpheus existed, the image of Orpheus is that of a hero, prophet, and high priest of religion. The question is whether he was a religious reformer of Dionysus-infested Thrace, but wanted to preserve Apollonian measure. But on the other hand, there is abundant evidence about an essential unity of Apollo and Dionysus in Greek religion. As we hear in the tragic poet Euripides, at Delphi they honor thee Orpheus with a double title, calling thee Apollo and Dionysus. And Guthrie's 1952 study, still well worth reading, was written in a reconstructive mode against the backdrop of the rise of Orpheoskeptical approaches, such as those of Wilamowitz, Lobeck's Aglaophamus, and leading eventually to Linforth's Arts of Orpheus. For its overall account of Greek religion, Guthrie would be unsurpassed until West's 1983 The Orphic Poems, and along the way, worthy of mention are Gunther Zunz's Persephone, 3 essays on religion and thought in Magna Graecia, which sets the scholarly study of the Orphic gold leaves on solid ground. Since then, astonishing new archaeological discoveries such as additional gold leaves, Deveni papyrus in 1962, and the bone fragments from Olbia would continue to revolutionize the field of Orphic studies, making it one of the most rich, challenging, and fascinating fields in classical studies by the beginning of the 21st century and through to the present day. Here are just a few of the must-have studies for any serious student of Orphism. Specifically on the Deveni papyrus, there are many major studies, but most affordable is Gabor Bate's The Deveni Papyrus, and on the gold leaves in particular, to be recommended are Fritz Graft and Sarah Johnston's Ritual Texts for the Afterlife, and Bernabé's and Cristobal's Instructions for the Netherworld. Most recently, Radcliffe Edmonds has published Redefining Ancient Orpheus and an edited volume on the Orphic gold leaves, Radcliffe representing a new approach to Orphic studies that Chrysanthou takes to task in her 2021 book, Defining Orphism. This depth and breadth of material would warrant an entire lecture series. As this is an introductory lecture to Orpheus and Orphic religion, its focus on what is still considered the landmark studies to the contemporary study of Orphism, Martin L. West's book, The Orphic Poems, published in 1983. In a heartbreaking preface, West mentions he started the book in 1971, but was prevented from finishing it for over 20 years by the shenanigans of various Italian and English scholars and nobles. The Deveni papyrus, without which West could not complete the study, had been discovered and transcribed by then, but S.G. Kapsomenos, who promised to send West a copy in 1967, never did, despite a personal visit and ongoing correspondence. West was for a long time limited to transcriptions. He took off only parts of the papyrus from the public display in the Thessalonica Museum. Sir Eric Turner was brought in to appeal his case, but no progress was made. It turned out later that Turner already had a copy. He never shared with West either. It wasn't until the task of creating a scholarly edition of the Deveni papyrus was undertaken by other scholars that West finally received the complete text in 1980. Classy as always, despite this shabby and inconsiderate treatment, West says he finally returned to the book then and, quote, was much benefited from renewed attention after a long pause. The delay had, after all, been salutary. Here's how West introduces the topic of Orpheus and Orphic studies. The magic of Orpheus's song drew animals and trees. The magic of his name has attracted a more unruly following, a motley crowd of romantics and mystics, of impostors and poetasters, of dizzy philosophers and disoriented scholars. The disorientation of the scholars is understandable after so many centuries in which Orpheus was all things to all men. For generations, they wrestled, each after his own fashion, with the problem of the origins of the Orphic poems and the pseudo-problem of the supposed Orphic religion, or more often, they confused the issue by arbitrarily attaching the label Orphic to texts and doctrines not attested as Orphic. Certainly, some secure results were obtained. It has long been settled, for example, that the extant Orphic hymns were composed in the imperial period and the Orphic Argonautica in late antiquity, but on many more central questions, opinions still diverge widely. The so-called Orphic Rhapsodies, much the longest and most influential of all Orphic poems, but known to us only in fragments, has been variously dated to the 6th century BCE, to the Hellenistic age, or even later. Truly, one can only speak of disorientation so long as such a massive uncertainty remains unresolved. And so West introduces what he considered in 1983 the Holy Grail, the central problem of how to understand those fragments of the Rhapsodic Theogony which have come down to us. However, the Rhapsodic Theogony was only one of 3 Orphic theogonies distinguished and cited by a late Neoplatonic writer. We shall see that in fact no less than 6 Orphic theogonies can be identified. The student who browses in Curran's Orphicorum Fragmenta for the first time quickly comes to the conclusion that this kind of complication is a normal feature of Orphic literature. He finds 3 separate poems on the rape of Persephone and a poem called Testament in 3 different redactions. He finds fragments disposed under 36 different titles, besides others which are of uncertain placement or questionable authenticity. What is worse, he remains for the most part without guidance on the dates and connections of all these works, and he is aware that in some cases at least, they are the subject of wide disagreement. He feels he has strayed into quicksand. More recently, building from, extending, and in some cases critiquing the work of West, Chrysanthou has argued for a more meticulous reconstruction than previously of the Rhapsodic Cosmogony. Our latest reconstruction of this cosmogony begins, "I will sing for those who are wise. Cover your ears, you profane. O Master Apollo, son of Leto, you who shoot with your rays from afar, radiant and mighty, you who oversee everything and rule over mortals and immortals. Sun raised up in the air with golden wings, you have addressed me with your godlike voice 12 times. And since you have spoken to me, you who shine from afar, I have made my witness." At which the cosmogony itself begins. Time was the pre-existing cause of all things. From Chronos, the one that never gets old and has imperishable counsel, ether was born, and a great chasm stretching from this side to the other. And it did not have an end nor a bottom, neither any foundation, and everything was undivided in the dark mist, and everything was held together by gloomy night, who covered what was under ether. Then great Chronos created a shining egg along with the divine ether, and Protogonus Phaethon, the son of enormous ether, began to move in an incredible circle. And Phanes broke through the clouds of his bright tunic from the divided shell of the great encompassing egg. He sprang upwards, first of all, the hermaphrodite and highly honored Protogonus, with 4 eyes looking all around, with golden wings moving all around. And at the time that Phanes sprung up, the misty chasm below and windless ether were separated. He had the heads of a fierce bull and of a lion with incandescent look, female and father, almighty god Erechtheus, cherishing in his heart swift and eyeless Eros. Return to the more careful interpretation of this reconstructed opening of the Rhapsodies, but we can see how it corresponds to the basic outline already provided in Guthrie. West's methodological axioms in beginning this line of inquiry into Orphic studies begins from the warning that questions that we lack evidence to decide are better left undecided. In the Orphic case, however, the difficulty is not so much absence of evidence as the fact that the evidence is both complex and fragmentary. West believes it is possible to sort it out more thoroughly and put it together more cogently than has been done hitherto, and Chrysanthou would seem to have extended this method. Unexpected new evidence has allowed the picture to be filled out while reminding us that it is far from being a complete picture. West thus prefers, unlike Chrysanthou, to speak not of Orphic religion, but simply of Orphic literature, not of Orphism or the Orphics. Much of the fog which beset the subject in the past, of which wisps still linger, arose from the confusion of these concepts, and he explains that this is because there was no doctrinal criterion for ascription to Orpheus and no copyright restriction. It was a device used for conferring antiquity and authority upon texts that stood in need of them. And so we must never say the Orphics believed this or that, and anyone who does so must be asked sharply, which Orphics? West gives us an example of this new method when he points to the recent discovery at the site of Olbia, which has made it probable that there existed a sect there in the 5th century BCE who may be properly called Orphic. They use the term Orphikoi. So it is possible for West to speak of the Olbian Orphics in this way. When he talk about the Orphics in general, or Orphism, needs to take note of this fashion for claiming Orpheus as an authority, the history of Orphism being in large part the history of that fashion. This sets the bar for evidence to speak of particular groups of Orphism pretty high, and as we'll see, later scholars like Chrysanthou rise to the challenge. West sums up the myths most commonly associated with the names of Orpheus succinctly. 4 separate stories about Orpheus are attested in classical times, all reflecting his unique musical gifts. Earliest poetry attributed to Orpheus is particularly appropriate to his shamanistic nature, but that he does not represent an isolated intrusion of shamanistic elements into Greek myth and legend. His descent into the underworld, his spells and incantations, and the sacred myth about the dismemberment and renovation of Dionysus all reflect a special kind of initiation that the shaman is supposed to undergo. According to West, Orpheus's Hellenization involved a measure of rationalization. Orpheus's miraculous accomplishments dominating animals, retrieving his wife from Hades, came to be seen simply as deriving from his excellence at singing. Nevertheless, we should think of the earliest Orpheus less as simply a musician theologos and more as a shamanistic figure. We can distinguish two main stages of Orphic lore. One, Orpheus as the great shaman of the past, of poems of a shamanistic character describing journeys to Hades, or of poems composed in and for religious circles whose rituals contained elements of shamanistic origin. But then secondly, his name more generally comes to stand for poems which revealed the truth about such matters as the nature and destiny of the soul or the sacred history of the gods. For West, both stages are represented in the earliest attested Orphic poems from the 6th to the early 5th centuries BCE. Furthermore, the use of Orpheus as the authority on all religious and mythological matters began around this time, and we can reconstruct this because of a threefold convergence of lines of evidence. We have the early Pythagorean Orphica, evidence of the Bacchic mysteries in their Orphic connection, including the more recently discovered Olbian bone fragments, as well as the Duveni papyrus. On the theme of Orphic music, or Orpheus's lyre, and the musical descent and ascent, the evidence comes from significantly later. Some say that Orpheus's lyre had 7 strings, corresponding to the 7 circles of heaven. Varro says there was an Orphic book about summoning the soul, called the lyre, and it is said that souls need the kithara in order to ascend. This testimony reflects a residue of the shamanistic Orpheus in the later musical theological one. For West, the musical correspondences that accrue around the name of Orpheus are mainly the product of Hellenistic speculation and involve a significant amount of Pythagoreanization of Orphic poems. And here we are still almost in total darkness as to what extent Pythagoras, if he existed, was influenced by Orphic communities and poems of his own period. Some testimonies suggest that Pythagoras even wrote books under the name of Orpheus. The use of lyre music as helping the soul ascend is also alluded to by Cicero, who, after explaining the music of the spheres, writes, "By imitating this on their strings and in song, learned men have opened the way for themselves to return to this place, heaven, like others of outstanding gifts who have devoted earthly life to studying the divine." The tradition of simulation of cosmic music on the lyre or kithara and by vocalization, which is intoning the 7 vowels in magic rituals attested in the Greek magical papyri, thought to enable the soul to escape the bonds of common death and return to the divine sphere or spheros from which it came. That being a general introduction to the historical reality or not of the figure of Orpheus and the enormous complexity of the modern field of Orphic studies, and most of us in the class probably not being disciples of Orpheus or scholars in this very specialized field, let's turn now to some of the more compelling and fascinating invocations of Orpheus in the history of poetry, working backwards from the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke and his famous Sonnets to Orpheus, and then looking at Ovid's most canonical account of Orpheus's wedding with Eurydice and descent to the underworld to fetch her. Rilke's first sonnet to Orpheus, which came over him in a whirlwind of inspiration by the castle of Dueno, upon completing his magnum opus, the Dueno Elegy, begins, "There rose a tree, O pure ascension, O Orpheus sings, O tall tree in the ear, and all was still, and even in this suspension, new beginnings, signs, and changes were. Animals from the silence, from the clear, now opened wood came forth from nest and den. And so it came to pass that not from fear or craftiness were they so quiet then, but to be listening. Howling, cry, roar seemed little to their hearts, where scarce a humble hut for such reception was before, a hiding place of obscurest yearning, with entrance shafts whose underpinnings tremble, you made for the beasts temples in the hearing." Rilke's sonnet here poeticizes West's first myth of Orpheus and his special relationship to animals through his music, indeed the axis mundi or world tree that the Orphic poet sings. The significance of Orpheus is that he gathers animal worlds around him as easily as human ones and quells all animal fear, anxiety, and longing in the human soul. In Orpheus, humanity and animality together are gathered into a temple. And the second of Rilke's sonnets moves on from the world tree and Orpheus as the enchanter of the animal soul to the figure of Eurydice, Persephone, to the soulmate or anima image torn away into the world below. Almost a girl she was, and forth she sprang from this harmonious joy of song and lyre, shining through her springtime veils and clear, and made herself a bed inside my ear, and slept in me, and her sleep was everything. The trees I forever marveled at, and these palpable distances, the deep-felt meadows, and everything in life that wondrously to me befell. She slept the world, O singing God, how have you perfected her? She never once needed to wake. She rose and fell asleep. Where is her death? Ah, will you introduce that theme before your song expires? I can feel her drifting off from me, and where? A girl, almost. Poeticizing the Cora, the maiden, or Persephone in terms of the Orphic poet's beloved, we see here sounded the theme of Eurydice's death and Orpheus's descent. And this is what makes Orpheus the most relatable character in Greek mythology, through his overwhelming love and mourning over the loss of his wife. Here you see an image of Orpheus at the tomb of Eurydice by the French symbolist painter Gustave Moreau from 1891. Thus, prior to his descent, Rilke sings in the third sonnet regarding the gods who preside over the Orphic journey. A god could do it, that is, descend to the underworld, but how, tell me, could a man follow him through the narrow lyre? His mind divides, or is dichotomy. Where two hearts' roads cross, there stands no temple for Apollo. Rilke here underlining the significance of Apollo for the Orphic poet, but also his deep alliance through love, Eurydice, and the underworld with the Dionysian. Singing, as you teach it, Orpheus, is not desire and not the courting of some end at last attained, but singing is being. Gesang ist Dasein, easy for a god to do. But tell us, when are we? When does he, that is Orpheus, cast all the earth and stars upon our being? It's not you, youth, you who are in love, even if your voice forces open your mouth. Learn to forget your early rash songs. They elapse. True singing is a different breath, an andhra atman, a breath serving nothing, or a breath around nothing, a gust in the god, a wind. And thus, in the first three of these sonnets, Rilke introduces all the essential motifs needed for our understanding of the wife of Orpheus, that is, Eurydice, or Eurydice. The name itself, Eurydice, means wide ruling, and thus evokes images of cosmic justice and the ultimate arbitration of mortal love by the gods of the underworld. Martin L. West wonders whether the myth of Eurydice is an essential part of Orpheus's earliest mythology or not. His descent to and presence in the underworld might be more simply explained by the fact that he is the savior of many souls there. Nevertheless, both Plato and Euripides, long before Ovid, speak of the descent of Orpheus to fetch his wife, but there her name is not given as Eurydice. Sometimes she has other names. That Virgil and Ovid concur in Eurydice as the name has even caused some scholars to suppose that they were both working from a lost Alexandrian version of the Orpheus myth. Sometimes Eurydice is imagined as having originally been a Thracian nymph, or a dryad or tree nymph. As early as Plato, we find the basic outline according to which Orpheus was unsuccessful in prevailing upon Hades' Persephone to release his wife. Rather than, as in Ovid, being able to accompany Eurydice almost to the threshold of the underworld, in Plato, Hades and Persephone simply show Orpheus a phantom of his wife, and even depict him as lacking the courage to just die to be reunited with her. The prohibition against looking back, although the most remembered thing in Orpheus mythology, and indeed a universal theme in world mythologies, may in fact have been a later addition to the Greek myth. Regardless of these questions of the original myth versus later accretions, there can be no doubt that the Roman poet Ovid's version of the wedding and descent of Orpheus has become the standard version and was Rilke's source in many of his Orphic poems. So let's look a bit more into detail into Ovid's version of Orpheus mythology. On Orpheus's wedding day, Hymen, the god of marriage, wrapped in his saffron-colored cloak, left the wedding of Iphis and Ianthe and made his way through the vast tracts of air to the shore of the Thracian Cyclades. He came at the call of Orpheus, but in vain, for although he was present here, he did not smile or bless the pair or give good omens. Even the torch of the god of weddings, Hymen, keeps sputtering with smoke that draws tears and would not burn, despite vigorous shaking. And the outcome was even more serious than this ominous beginning, for while the bride was wandering through the grass, accompanied by a band of naiads, she was bitten on the ankle by a serpent and collapsed into death. We must ask here, has Ovid simply turned the Orpheus myth into yet another romantic love story with the theme of love triumphing over death? Or can we read Orpheus's descent into the underworld as a religious attempt to retrieve and fulfill the most sacred wedding and the mysteries of chthonic descent? As Ovid renders Orpheus's descent to Styx, or the underworld, past the insubstantial multitudes of ghosts beyond the grave, he approached Persephone and her lord, who rule this unlovely realm of shadows, and sang his song as he plucked the strings of his lyre, singing, "O deities of the world below the earth, into which all of us who are mortal return. If it is right and you allow me to utter the truth, I did not come down to see the realm of Tartarus or to bind the triple neck bristling with serpents of the monstrous hound. The cause of my journey is my wife. She stepped on a snake, and its venom, coursing through her veins, stole from her the bloom of her years. I wanted to be able to endure, and I admit that I have tried. But love has conquered. He is a god who is well known in the world above. I suspect that he is famous even here as well, although I do not know for sure. If the story of the abduction of long ago is not a lie, then love also brought you two together. And so Orpheus's plaintive argument to Hades and Persephone to return his wife turns into a willingness to sacrifice himself. He pleads to have the thread of Eurydice's living destiny reweaved, and he argues almost sophistically, by Chaos and Tartarus, that Hades and Persephone will receive her in the end. They hold the longest sway over the human race, so why not give her back now? Quote, I ask as a gift her return to me. If the fates refuse this reprieve, it is sure that I do not wish to return either. Take joy in the death of us both. This archetype of the poet who would rather die than be deprived of his beloved partner, or the hierogamy with a specific mortal woman, will end up after a long path being the model for Dante's relationship to Beatrice in La Vita Nuova, for Provençal love poetry, and especially for Shakespeare's myth of Romeo and Juliet. In Ovid, what we witness is the invention, before Christianity, of the idea of an eternal love, the very crucible for our modern notion of the soulmate. Already in Ovid, the effects of this song on the underworld are immense. As Orpheus sings his plaintive song, the bloodless spirits weep. Tantalus stops reaching for the receding waters, and the wheel of Ixion stops. The vultures cease tearing at the liver of Tityus, and Sisyphus sits on his stone, rather than endlessly rolling it up the hill. And then, for the first time, the cheeks of the Eumenides are moist with tears, as they are overcome with the song. And the king Hades, who rules these lower regions, and his regal wife could not endure his plaint or its refusal, and they called on the soul of Eurydice among the more recently departed shades. And she approached, her step slow, because of her wound from the serpent. Thracian Orpheus took her. With her was given the command that he not turn back his gaze until he left the groves of Avernus, or that the gift of his wife would be revoked. The groves of Avernus is another Roman name for Hades, and the term Avernus, or Averni, was used by ancient naturalists for certain lakes, grottos, or other places which infect the air with poisonous streams or vapors, and so connect this middle world with the underworld, such as at the volcanic crater of Cumae, and Orpheus's second loss of Eurydice because of the fatal error of looking back. Ovid is not extremely detailed. They were not far from the border of the world above, here frightened that she might not be well, and yearning to see her with his own eyes. Through love he turned and looked, and with his gaze, she slipped away and down. This trope of looking away is distinctively part only of the Roman depiction of Orpheus, and hence we also find it in Virgil. There is no clear evidence for it, however, in earlier Greek sources for Orpheus. And Ovid sings Eurydice's own second death in these terms. Now, as Eurydice was dying for a second time, she did not reproach her husband, for what complaints should she have except that she was loved? She uttered for a very last time a farewell that barely reached his ear, and fell back once more to the same place. And so it is from Ovid that we inherit the burning question that fascinates us all. Why did Orpheus look back? And on this, Ovid is explicit, as we've just seen. He was both frightened that she might not be well, and yearning to see her with his own eyes. So it was love that allowed his petition to be successful for her release from Hades. And it was also love through which he turned and looked. In Virgil's version in Book 4 of his Georgics, it is at the verge of the upper air, beyond the vapors of Avernus, that a, quote, sudden frenzy seized the unwary lover, worthy of pardon except by a pitiless underworld. Orpheus stopped and, unmindful, alas, and overcome in spirit, looked back at his own Eurydice. Then and there his labor was spent in vain, end quote. Explore the variations of this motif by countless artists over the centuries. In their interpretation of Orpheus's tragic decision is a fascinating undertaking. In many subsequent versions, Eurydice herself, unaware of the pact that Orpheus has sworn and unable to understand the cold cruelty of her beloved husband, will not turn to give him comfort, but will even assail him with desperate and anguished pleas. Did the master musician lose faith in the power of his art here, as the textbook suggests? Had the gods imposed a condition that they knew would never be fulfilled? Such a paradoxical quandary or conundrum of love and fate or destiny has of course proved irresistible in the history of Western art. I recommend especially Jean Cocteau's Orpheus trilogy in film, Gluck's earlier opera, Orpheus and Eurydice, and before it, of course, the very origin of opera in the West, modeled on Greek tragedy, Monteverdi's Orfeo, and more recently Matthew Aucoin's Eurydice from the New York Metropolitan Opera, are all worthy explorations of this core myth. It has indeed been recreated again and again, with imagination, beauty, and profundity. Having become by Roman times the archetype of the poet and the musician, Orpheus has since become the image of the great and the universal power of art. And so one finds images of Orpheus and Eurydice everywhere one goes. For example, this famous marble relief of Hermes Psychopompos, guide of the underworld, Orpheus and Eurydice, thought to be a Roman copy of a Greek original of the 5th century BCE, and featuring a tender communion of Orpheus and Eurydice before Hermes whisks her away and back into the land of the shades, continues to be reproduced as a seal of immortal love. I was very surprised when arriving for the first time in my life at the Neckar or Danube River in Germany to find this cafe decked with Grecian murals and claiming to be on the site of the discovery of the first pygmy horse in Western Europe, to also find a bronze reproduction of the Orpheus, Eurydice, and Hermes stelae. A fortuitous circumstance or synchronicity which most likely would never have occurred without the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke having written a great poem in his new poems, Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes, already in 1907. Let's take a look now at Rilke's rendition of the Orpheus, Eurydice myth in this poem, in order to be able to compare it with Ovid's, which was undoubtedly its major source. Rilke begins, "It was the soul's strange mine, like silent silver ore, they wandered through its dark-like veins. Between roots, the blood welled up that makes its way to men, and it looked hard as porphyry in the dark. Nothing else was red. Rocks were there and unreal forests, bridges spanning voids, and that huge gray, blind, unmoving lake that hung above its distant bed, like rainy sky above a landscape. And between meadows, soft and full of patience, the pale stripe of the single path, laid down like a long pallor being bleached, and on this single path they came." Quick pause here to note that Dorothy's Yellow Brick Road in The Wizard of Oz is a thinly veiled remake On a less wholesome and childlike theme, it is the pale stripe of the single path in the surreal geography of the underworld upon which Orpheus and Eurydice walk. In front, the slender man in the blue mantle, that's Orpheus, who mutely and impatiently stared straight ahead. His stride devoured the paths in huge bites without slowing to chew. His hands hung heavy and clenched from the drape of the folds, and no longer felt the delicate lyre that had entwined itself into his left like a rose tendrils into an olive bow. And his senses were as if split in two. For a while the sight raced ahead like a dog, turned around and came back, and then again stood waiting, far away at the next sharp bend. His hearing lagged behind like a smell. The enmeshment of Orpheus's lyre in his very body as he attempts to lead Eurydice out of the underworld is here underlined, as well as his dog-like nature as a tracker of the gods. In this case, the scent that he picks up on is his own hearing and his attempt to coordinate his song with Eurydice's ascent. Here, Rilke turns to the role of Hermes in this story, the god of faring and of distant messages, the traveling helmet over shining eyes, the slender staff held out before the body, and at the ankles the flutter of wings, and entrusted to his right hand, her, the one so loved that from a single lyre came more lament than ever from lamenting women, that from a lament a world arose in which everything had life again. Forest and valley and road and village, field and flock and stream, and that around this lament world, just as around the other earth, a sun turned and a star-filled silent heaven, a lament heaven with anguished stars, this one so loved. But now she walked at that god's hands, her steps constrained by long winding sheets, uncertain, gentle, and without impatience. She was within herself like a woman close to birth, and thought not of the man who walked ahead, and not of the path ascending into life. She was within herself, and her having died filled her like abundance. Like a fruit with the sweetness and night, she was filled with her great death, which was so new that she understood nothing. Eurydice being the real heroine of this poem, Rilke's rendition, she has no ultimate need of Orpheus, but is fulfilled already in her great death. She was in a new virginity and untouchable. Her sex had closed as a young flower at the approach of evening, and her hands had been so weaned from marriage that even the light god's infinitely soft, guiding touch hurt her like too great a liberty. She was no longer the blonde wife who echoed often in the poet's songs, no longer the vast bed sent an island, and that man's property no longer. She was already loosened like long hair, and given over like fallen rain, and handed out like a limitless supply. She was already root. And when, without warning, the god stopped her, and with pain in his voice spoke the words, "He has turned around," she was puzzled and answered softly, "Who?" And thus ends Rilke's poem, Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes. In this poem, Eurydice has no need of Orpheus, and she even forgets who he is, being so fulfilled in herself by her great death. The anima image is liberated from the Orphic poet who sings her, becoming this man's property no longer. Eurydice acquires freedom in her oblivion, and the Orphic poet must carry on without her. Moving on to the myths of Orpheus's death, some testimony states that after he lost his wife a second time, Orpheus went mad and committed suicide. Another myth suggests that Zeus was angry at Orpheus for sharing the mysteries with all humanity, like Prometheus, and so struck him with a thunderbolt. The third and by far most popular myth says he was murdered by Maenads, that is, female devotees of the god Dionysus, sometimes called Basarids, as in Aeschylus. After Eurydice died, Orpheus climbed Mount Pangaea near Olympus every day to worship Helios Apollo. In doing this, he turned away from Dionysus, and thus the Maenads, offended on behalf of the god, slew him. One traditional burial place of Orpheus and an archaeological site you can visit is in ancient Livithra in the Acropolis near Mount Pyrrhia. As Ovid sings the death of Orpheus, quote, "While the Thracian bard was inducing the woods, the rocks, and the hearts of wild beasts to follow him, Ciconian women, their frenzied breasts clad in animal skins, spied Orpheus from the top of a hill as he was singing to his lyre. One of them, her hair tossing in the light breeze, exclaimed, 'Ah, look, here he is, the one who despises us.' The women throw all manner of weapon and object, but as each one hurtled, it was overcome in mid-air by the harmony of the voice and the lyre, and fell at his feet like a suppliant apologizing for so furious an assault. But the Maenads' hostility grew more bold, and restraint was abandoned until the fury of madness held absolute sway. All weapons would have been softened by his song, but the great clamor, the Phrygian flutes, the drums and the pounding, and the Bacchic shrieks drowned out the sound of his lyre. Then at last the stones that could not hear grew red with the blood of the poet. But first the Maenads seized the hordes of birds, still spellbound by the singer's voice, the serpents, the throng of beasts, all testimonies to the triumph of his song. But when they turned with bloody hands on Orpheus himself, like birds that throng together at any time they see the owl of night abroad by day, they collected the farmer's tools as well, to met out the poet's fate. His soul breathed forth, receding on the wind. O Orpheus, for you the trees let fall their leaves, and shorn of foliage made lament. The rivers too swelled with grief, his limbs lie scattered in various places. And lyre you got, O river Hebrus, and O wonder, while they floated in midstream, the lyre made some plaintive lamentations. The lifeless tongue murmured laments too, and the banks murmured in reply. According to one ancient testimony, the head of Orpheus and his lyre land eventually on the island of Lesbos, where Apollo rescues them from a serpent. And as Ovid concludes, the shade of Orpheus went down below the earth and recognized all the places he had seen before. He looked amid the fields of the pious and found Eurydice and clasped her in his eager arms. And here now they walk together, side by side. Sometimes he follows her as she proceeds, and sometimes he goes ahead in safety, now looking back at his Eurydice. And here you see 3 canvases by Gustave Moreau of the Thracian maiden carrying the head of Orpheus, which we could call the original Cheshire Cat. According to Philostratus in the 2nd century CE, the head of Orpheus drifted to Lesbos, lodged in a chasm on Lesbos, and sang its prophecies in an earthen chamber. Thereafter it was used for prophecies not only by the lesbians, but also by all the Aeolians and their neighbors, the Ionians. Oracles from this shrine were sent even to Babylon, the head singing many prophecies relating to the king of Persia. An earlier passage from Phoenicles in the 3rd century BCE further reveals the mythological background of the lesbian oracle. The women cut off his head with their bronze, and straightway they threw it in the sea with his Thracian lyre of the tortoise shell, and by fastening them together with a nail, so that both would be borne on the sea and drenched by the grey waves. The hoary sea brought them to land on holy Lesbos, and thus the lyre's clear ring held sway over the sea and the islands and the sea-soaked shores, where men gave the clear-sounding head of Orpheus its funereal rites. And here you see in John William Waterhouse's depiction this very image of the head staked to his lyre. Orpheus, being of the race midway between gods and humans, a demigod, reveals the underlying qualities or mind of all created nature. From ancient Greek vase painting to John Deville, the image of the head of Orpheus mounted in his lyre has taken on a universal significance, representing the triumph of the mind and its song over death. French symbolist painter Odillon Redon also approaches this theme at the turn of the 20th century in a series of luminous pastels. Redon remarking in notebooks that the muses preserved the head of Orpheus so that it could continue to sing forever. A haunting musical experience that Redon depicts with blended deep hues of blue, pigment with bold textured strokes of yellow and orange, to create an abstract spiritual landscape of disembodied spectrality and ghostly presence, wherein the book and the lyre evoke for us an elemental sensorium. or echo of universal music. Due to the gruesomeness of his death at the hands of spurned and angry women, some sources underline that Orpheus was not a passive victim of the Thracian women but an active misogynist, and suggest that after the death of Eurydice, he shunned the company of women and only accepted that of boys and men. In Plato's myth of air as well, Orpheus chooses to be reincarnated as a swan because of his distaste for mortal women, the Maenads. Though this idea of a conversion on Orpheus's part from worship of Dionysus to worship of Apollo seems suitable to Plato's overall project. According to Guthrie, the practice of tattooing among Thracian women was said to be the punishment inflicted on them by their husbands for the murder of Orpheus. As we find as well in the disapproving Plutarch, we can find no praise for the Thracians, but they brand their wives to this day to avenge Orpheus. But this tells us very little about the original nature of Orpheus's cult, if it existed. The fact that it had women followers suggests that it may have been more feminine and devoted to Dionysus. Guthrie asks, is it even conceivable that he was in fact torn to pieces by men for luring women into Bacchic rites? Was he simply playing with too much fire and torn to pieces by his own female followers? In any case, the classical evidence suggests that private Orphic rituals required the presence of both men and women, and that women were Orphic initiates. As Rilke sings the death of Orpheus in the conclusion of the first part of his sonnets, but you, the divine one, unto the last, still singing, although attacked by the flouted Maenads' throng. Beautiful God, above the shrieks rose ringing, among the destroyers your ordered upbuilding song. There was none there could harm your head or harp, however they raved and struggled. All the sharp stones they cast at you grew soft when nearing your heart, and touching you were endowed with hearing. Finally, driven by vengeance, they broke and tore your body, but in cliffs and lions lingered your music. In birds and trees, you still sing there. O you lost God, you never-ending clue, only since hatred at last parceled you out among us, are we hearers and a mouth for nature. Here, Orpheus, rather than being associated with a transcendent mind or rational theology, is the very voice embedded in nature, the Greek phusis, which reveals things as they truly are in equanimity, despite all hostility and the destructive Dionysian force of his martyrdom. In this lecture, we've just scratched the surface of Orpheus, Orphism, and Orphic studies. Guthrie and West, most focused on here, are still important entry points, but really just the tip of the iceberg. Untreated in this lecture, and perhaps saved for a future one, is a more in-depth study of the Duveni Papyrus and the Protagonist Theogony underlying it, as well as of the Eudemian, Cyclic, and Hieronyman Theogonies. Nor have we treated in detail the Orphic gold leaves. Perhaps the best single place to start now for a more careful study is Chrysanthou's 2021, Defining Orphism, the Beliefs, the Teletai, and the Writings. For an excellent recent video on the philosophy behind the Orphic mysteries, you can check out Esoterica on YouTube. And for more on the Orphic gold leaves, I would particularly recommend Earl Fontenelle's The Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast, episodes 22 and 23. Let's conclude this lecture today with a review of some of the conclusion in Chrysanthou's work, itself an astonishing accomplishment at the level of Martin West and other Orphic scholars, especially for someone so young. Chrysanthou concludes her most recent book. One thing that has become evident is that we can only define Orphism if we examine all the evidence together. The textual comparison between Orphic and non-Orphic sources allowed us to distinguish Orphic terminology and identify references to Orphism which might not have been discernible if the material had been examined in isolation. Three major patterns have emerged: the importance of texts and their correct understanding, the cosmological nature of Orphic eschatology, and the curative and transformative nature of Orphic practices. Whether it was offering the means to escape the cycle of rebirths through acquiring knowledge and waking the memory, or the atonement of wrongdoings, the Orphic texts and practices had the power to heal and restore. Orphism can therefore be defined as a practical theology, which spread throughout Greece and through time, influencing public rites, forming esoteric mysteries, and becoming material for bricolage by religious practitioners. And here we can distinguish three different strands. One, public rites based on Orphic mythology, 2 esoteric initiation mysteries with specific eschatological beliefs of a cosmological nature based on Orphic texts, and 3 religious practices performed by itinerant priests who made use of Orphic texts such as the Guru Papyrus in combination with other religious elements. Skipping ahead to her last paragraph, and so as not to give too many spoilers, Chrysanthou concludes that her interpretation of the Orphic texts and sources and her definition of Orphism differs from the scholarly understanding of the matter up to this date. Quote, "During my journey, I have identified various attitudes to Orphism in scholarship. There are those who categorize Orphism under ancient magic, those who approach anything Orphic with the presupposition of it being inferior and marginal to normal Greek religion, whatever that is, and those who choose to ignore the matter altogether due to its bafflingness, and those who treat it as an external or exotic phenomena. The list could go on and on. All these attitudes cannot be justified considering the vastness of Orphic material present in ancient Greek sources, and I hope that the analysis I have pursued in this book has shown that Orphism was a much bigger and more influential phenomena. A phenomena whose beginnings were rooted so deeply in archaic times that often even our ancient sources are not entirely sure how to treat it. And this is one of the reasons why studying Orphism often feels elusive and enigmatic. Orpheus being classified alongside Homer as one of the earliest poets, Plato quoting from an Orphic text which he refers to as O Palaios Logos, most archaic, ancestral, or revered logos, the Derveni commentary on a text that was clearly well established and interpreted by the 5th century BCE, the early signs that Orphic religious activity and deities were already formed in the 7th to 6th centuries BC in areas such as Olbia, Phanagoria, and Chios, the close similarities of Orphic theologic texts to pre-Socratic philosophers, the frequent treatment of Orphic beliefs and rites by ancient authors as highly revered, and the reluctance of authors such as Herodotus to reveal any details, all point to the archaicness of Orphism, a phenomena which continued to evolve and adapt in the following centuries, at the same time influencing the formation of Greek religious rites and eschatological beliefs, and becoming material for bricolage. It is through observing the light coming in through the cracks of the door which keeps us, the modern versions of the profane, out of the locale where everything is explained. And through the aid of later authors who begun to be more revealing about Orphic texts and beliefs, that we were able to get an understanding of this major chapter of ancient Greek religion. Thanks for listening to this challenging lecture, everyone, and see you next time when we turn to Sophoclean mythology in the Theban saga. Have a good week.